Everybody, it's Eugene Liscio. Welcome. This is episode 11 of Forensics Talks. I've broken the 10 episode barrier, which is pretty cool. Just a couple announcements before we get started here. And the first one is that I'm going to be having that Cloud Compare course that's coming up on November 23rd. There's been a whole bunch of people that have registered, which is really fantastic. If you're working with 3D technologies, photogrammetry, laser scanning, and you're interested in doing more, Cloud Compare is an open source program that is available, and I'm offering a little training package on there to go from zero to being proficient at editing and doing stuff with your 3D point clouds. Also, there's a conference just next week. It's the International Association of Bloodstain Pattern Analysts, and that's a full week of different sessions. So there's 3 sessions. There's an European session, there's an America session, and an Asia Pacific session. So if you're interested in bloodstain pattern analysis, it's for $30. It's a great deal to get to. You get access to all the presentations, and I believe they're actually being recorded. So if you can't make some of the sessions, you can get on them later on as well. So we're going to get started just with a very brief introduction here for my speaker, my guest today. It's Dr. William Lewinski, and he has a BA in psychology and sociology from Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. He has a PhD in psychology from Union Institute and University, Cincinnati, Ohio, with a concentration on police psychology. From 1987 to 1992, he was the director of the law enforcement program at Mankato State University. 1997 to 98, chair of political science and law, enforcement department. 2003 to present, he's the director of the Forcescience Institute, and that's going to be a lot about what we talk about today. Dr. Lewinski's been involved in a lot of research, in training and consultation. He's presented at many conferences and has provided training for thousands of officers, especially the force science certification course. Interestingly, he was a clinical psychologist before, so he has some experience there with working with children with disabilities, child development and support services in Winnipeg, Canada. And we were just talking about it from 1980 to now, for a very long time. He's the chief instructor of Mankato Goju Kai Karate Club, and I think that's pretty cool. I used to take karate when I was a kid, so let's bring him in here. There you are. Hey, Bill, how you doing?
Fine, thank you. Pleasure to be with you today.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for taking some time out. I know you're a busy person, and I appreciate you being here and sharing some of your knowledge and experience. The first thing that I want to ask is something that I ask everybody, and that is, a lot of students or even people in other professions right now, maybe one day want to get into the area that you're looking at, human behaviors and that sort of thing. And how did you fall into this? And so think about when you first started and what made you think about psychology, and then what was the path that brought you to where you are today?
Actually, I started reading psychology. I read my introductory textbook for psychology. My first year was at Loyola University of Chicago, and the introductory psychology textbook I read the summer between the 10th and 11th grade at Port Arthur Collegiate Institute. I just happened to pick it up. I was interested in it. And I've been on that track ever since. In the police world, I came to a nexus out of the martial arts experience. I was teaching arrest and control techniques, happened to be working with the Mounties while I was working with the Manitoba Department of Education as a psychologist with them. They were sharing some of the hostage negotiation techniques that we're learning out of Ottawa. And when the most dramatic hostage situation in Canadian history happened, it's the Oak Lake Verdun hostage situation. I was called in initially to do the debriefing, but I ended up actually out at the scene and directed the negotiation strategy that caused this. This individual who'd murdered a member of their sex club in Saskatchewan got in a shootout with the RCMP, killed 1, wounded 2, hit 4 hostage situations, changing hostages, guns, ammo, not barricaded, ending up in a doctor's residence. Full-blown psychopathic paranoid, off his medication, determined to stay there until his wounded spouse could travel. And at that point, my clinical supervisor was chairperson of the Canadian Psychiatric Association. I called Harry up and I said, Harry, we got this situation. And he said, if you don't get him out of there within 3 days, he's going to decompensate and kill everybody. And so we use strategies that had never been done before, primarily taken from Adlerian psychology. And we drove that situation to a successful conclusion. And in the middle of that, and you have to think January in Manitoba Prairie, it got to 20 below was the warmest. The SWAT team was out for 6 hours at a time. Cold weather. It was an amazing team performance. And I love being a support for that type of service, and decided I would change the direction of my life, and structured it so that I could actually end up teaching and working in the law enforcement area, in the area of psychological and human performance support.
Okay. And so if we talk about where you are today with the Force Science Institute, I mean, it's been around a while. I mean, it's not like a recent thing. Maybe some people are hearing about it more recently, but I mean, I've heard about it. It's years and years now. So who were some of the founding people in the Force Science Institute?
Well, one of the first things we did was establish, Patricia, the co-owner of Force Science, Patricia Thiem and I, established a national advisory board, which brought in all sorts of elements. Because when you start looking at human performance in high stress, whether you're looking at training or you're looking at forensic analysis, you're looking at a variety of components: perception, cognition, motor performance, learning skills, educational process, all of those. We're complex human beings, and if you go to a university psychology department, you'll see we're fractionated. Even our mind is fractionated into all sorts of components. And so we needed a broad-based board to facilitate that. And then we started moving forward, initially with research, and then with training. And now I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but now we've got really a most credentialed training staff in any police course, I think, in the world today.
Yeah, for sure. Well, a lot of what you do is, I mean, there's different aspects to your business. So one aspect is going to be the research that you guys do. You guys do plenty of research. Another aspect is the training. And then the other aspect is going to be consultation. You do some consultation work as well. So what is, if you had to summarize what Force Science Institute does, or what their mandate is, how would you best describe that?
Well, I think what our primary focus has always been to understand, to assess, and to measure, and to understand the types of circumstances officers get into, so we can then better prepare them for the circumstances that they will encounter. And so it's really a training perspective. Off that, we have a forensic or a consultation perspective that then serves as we try to translate that information into a forensic analysis of an incident. How does it relate? And then the main component that we're committed to is the issue about bringing the knowledge of human performance science to those who are investigating and also training in the police world. So we have a three-course mission, but it's all driven by research. For instance, could I give you an example?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I was on a meeting today with the International Association of Chiefs of Police, 2 subcommittees, and we're looking at recommending changing in the police profession based on what we learned about how well skills are learned and retained in the academy. We spent $1 million on a 5-year research project, primarily culminating on 3 years of data collection, analysis, and presentation. 10,000 videos made on skill acquisition, perishability of that skill over the course of the academy, up to 6 months after the academy. Amazing study, never been done before, published in a behavioral analyst journal. And the end result is officers leave the academy. It doesn't matter what skill we have taught them. They leave the academy to the point where they're not functional in a real world encounter. Okay. And that holds true with whether we're talking about the Ontario Police College or whether we're talking about Minnesota State University Mankato law enforcement program, or whether we're talking about the Oregon Police Academy. It doesn't matter. It's how we teach it and how many hours we teach, and the fact that we do almost no decision making by the time people leave the process. So our research is directing us to and allow us to make changes within the police profession. But if we look at another element, which would be, for instance, how long it takes officers to, for instance, to respond to a threat, and how that relates to bullet strikes in relation to subject movement in an encounter, that's tremendously supportive for training, for pre-event assessment, for positioning to establish, contain, and control an incident, for the use of communication to offset that. But if it does result in a shooting, all the decision and performance are made before the bullet strikes the body.
Yeah.
And so what are the human performance elements that go into that? And so it all kind of links together from the point of view of analysis, training, performance issues.
Well, I'm definitely gonna ask you. I have some other things I want to ask you about on the research side, and there's a lot there. There's more than we can fit into, okay. And 45 minutes. But let's talk about. I want to start sort of. I think it's good if we talk about some of the. Or let me ask you, what are some of the physical, the chemical, the mental, and even emotional changes that happen to people who are under high stress scenarios?
It really runs from it runs a range because we have a variety of human psychological strengths and experiences. So it runs from, and I've interviewed, advised, counseled well over 3,000 officers, been involved in shooting situations. And on one end is the officer who is focused intently on trying to respond to the threat and direct themselves to the threat. And by the way, we find the same sorts of psychological and performance elements in special operations teams with the military, Force Recon, Delta Team, SEAL Team, etc. We're looking at a focus on solving the problem and an emotional utilization to commit to the solution of the problem that presents itself to them. And so it's a really intense and very successful focus and performance.
When it comes to the human, I was showing the picture of the brain here. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to know what parts of the brain kick in when someone is, shocked under, just has to make a quick decision, fear or whatever. I mean, is there, if you're calm and you're just thinking and, you're using one part of your brain versus another part of your brain, how does all that affect decision-making, memory, all those things?
Well, if you think about it, the individual who's really focused on trying to solve the problem is really very frontal lobed engaged. And their emotional response, their amygdala and their hippocampus are really in service of that purpose. There's an emotional intensity that is used by these individuals, but it's under the control and regulation of their frontal lobes, their thought process and their experience. And the decisions usually are rapid, made in a particular type of fashion called RPD, or fast and frugal, but it's really an effective performance usually. On the other end of the spectrum, totally on the other end, are officers whose frontal lobes are shut down. And literally, we've been able to measure this with infrared spectrometry. We've been able to measure the decrease in the functioning of the frontal lobes as the amygdala, the emotional response center, begins to get activated. And officers are literally recoiling. And instead of shooting to stop the threat or addressing the threat, they are recoiling and trying to save their life. They will run, they will hide, they will freeze, they will do a variety of things, but it will not be productive.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That's because it's the low road of the brain. It's the primitive survival component is taking over, and they're emotionally recoiling. And it's the negative components of that. It's the freeze and the flight elements.
And I know you've done a lot of studies on reaction time and that sort of thing. So when a person is, if we are subject to these very primitive sort of reactions and things like that, are there ways to train to offset those sort of primitive instincts?
Yeah, yes, there are. And I want to point out there's a confusion about this, because people think that if you expose somebody to a stress set or a set of stress circumstances, that you will inoculate them to some sort of negative reaction. And stress and time are both similar in that time does not heal. It is what occurs during time that allows you to heal. And under stress circumstances, it's the same sort of thing. It is not stress that we inoculate ourselves to. It is how we prepare and build what we need to work effectively under that type of stress. So stress allows us to develop those resources. It's kind of like a muscle needs to be stressed to grow. And we need to be exposed in sequential ways to become familiar, to become skillful, to have confidence to operate in a particular situation. So we need confidence, we need competence, and we need exposure into the type of circumstances that will be confronting us, that will cause that emotional arousal, that will either turn positive or negative depending upon how we use it and what we bring to that incident.
Mm-hmm. If you look at the current, let's say current models for training across globally, even for police officers, and looking at the format of the training, looking at the duration of the training, and looking at how well the training actually, can be put into practice. I've read some things that you have commented on saying that there's a lot of deficiencies there. For example, like block training and the disadvantages of doing typical block training and that sort of thing. Can you comment on some of the changes that need to happen in the current training models for law enforcement?
Certainly, teaching things all at once, all together in a block, needs to be eliminated. Blocks are very good to begin to develop a skill, and then you need to integrate it with other skills, which is also eliminating the silo format. Because if you teach like one arrest and control technique totally apart from another, an officer goes to arrest somebody and it turns into a free fall, they're using all of those together in that free for all. And so we need to look at that, how it fits together. Communication is taught in a silo apart from any force. And so we need to link all of what we teach together. So block and silo need to be eliminated, and we need to do a little bit, a lot, and integrate it. But here's the key. Speak to a law enforcement officer. Ask them what they do, and they'll tell you they're making decisions all the time. If they're going to make a decision about what is the best recommendation or persuasion that they could provide for someone in a domestic battery situation, for instance, that's a decision process. If they're going to work on, say that they stop a teenager hitchhiking, there's information that says that person has a 50% chance of being the victim of a sexual or physical violence situation in the residence. And how do they approach that person to facilitate a discovery of that? That's a decision process. Mm-hmm. Cops are making decisions all day long. But if you look at any police academy, there's only a handful of decisions the officers make by the time they graduate, and that's mostly around force. Mm-hmm. Isn't that amazing? And most of the situations they get in with force, or at least a large part of that, can be offset or mediated to some degree if they were more effective at making decisions prior to the encounter. Yeah. But law enforcement is an assessment, diagnostic, prescriptive. It's a clinical profession. We don't like to look at it as a clinical. We almost treated our instructional process is to treat law enforcement as a trade. And ironically, we don't do very good at that because your plumber, your barber, your beautician, your cosmetologist easily get between 4 and 10 times more training than does your police officer.
Yeah, and I was reading
a job of treating it as a trade.
I don't remember where I read it, but it had this. It was the dog groomer gets like over 800 hours of training, right? And the typical police officer gets 400, 500 or something like that, and they're dealing with
or 700, right? But if you work for Petco and you're dog grooming for Petco, it's 800 hours of training you have to get. But you could be a cop in Ontario with less training than that.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, making decisions about force and liberty and death. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, for sure. What about retention of the current training model? Is it something that people lose after a short time? Is it something that they typically retain? Is there sort of like how effective is it at police officers retaining what they learn?
Well, what we found, and we measured physical skills because you could easily measure that. It is hard to measure paraphrasing, for instance. or paraverbals and the use of paraverbals. And so physical skills are easy to measure. We measured physical skills, but it's all taught in the same way. So we think that there's a crossover in application of the results. And I said earlier that by the time officers leave the academy, their skills, their functional skills, are not functional in an open, competitive situation. Mm-hmm. They are not functional even in a non-competitive controlled situation where they just have to demonstrate something. They can talk about it, but they can't do it in the academy before they graduate. They do it when they're taught the skill, but it erodes to the extent where it's not functional by the time they graduate.
Yeah. And I wonder how realistic it is too. Like, I don't know if the training really reflects a high stress situation, you know, that you're going to be dealing with when you're out there in the real world versus what you're doing in the academy. I don't know.
Well, when we tested, and certainly the Brits are being recommended as a way for us to model, and I think they do a lot of good things, but we tested their training program, and we actually ran it by some of the experts in the United Kingdom in motor learning and control. And we found that they were less effective than Canada or the US. But most importantly, they could not use resistance on any of the techniques that they learned in the academy, because if they used resistance, someone might be injured in the academy. And that speaks to the very point that you were talking about, because how much force can you use in practice? How realistic does it get? And particularly if the first time you encounter resistance is on the street and you're scrambling to figure out what to do, it's too late.
Yeah.
And so we need to build skills to a much higher level in what we're doing, and we need to provide great decision making with that, and that's right across the whole process. We're firm believers in de-escalation. In fact, when I taught and was a program director and chairperson in the law enforcement program and the Department of Government, I taught a 180-hour class in crisis intervention, combining physical, tactical skills, firearm skills with communication. So by the time people were finished, they were de-escalating an armed suicidal subject, coordinating in and out of perimeters, directing the suicidal person one of 6 possible outcomes. Mm-hmm. And that's a really kind of a unique kind of combination that we have to do, and because you're making points right along. You get information from an academy, you'll make a decision about what type of information do I need and what type of my plan am I going to make as I approach this person. What's my opening statement, my opening line, my positioning? Those are decisions we have got to take before people leave the academy.
Are there any standards for training, or I mean, who decides, that, hey, this program is, up to snuff or whatever? I mean, do you find that it's somewhat fractured, that, one academy is doing one thing, another academy is doing something else, or is there some kind of national, federal standard?
Right. Well, in the United States, we run from 400 plus hours to 1,600 plus hours. And that ranges from some of our southern states to California is running the highest. When I was director of the program, we had 1,650 hours for our police training program in Minnesota State. It's dropped significantly now, but that was the amount of time that we had. And the standards were set by individual state post boards. So it really varies pretty dramatically.
Yeah.
And the same in Canada.
Okay. I want to ask you about some of the research that's on your website. First off, I want to bring this up for some people, but if anyone's watching this and is interested, there's a whole bunch of references and articles on the Force Science website. You can just go to forcescience.org. Tons of material here, articles. Actually, their news section is actually quite good. There's some good information there as well. So I thought I'd point that out because I picked up some of the information there as well. There was a paper, Bozeman et al. In 2017. Its use of force. It talks about the use of force is rare in the police world, with less than 0.1% of all calls for service and 0.78% of all criminal arrests. So it's very, very infrequent. But the point is that even though it's very rare, it can be a very expensive in Denver when you're talking about the loss of life, lawsuits, and all this other stuff, right?
There's no question. The tragedy that is involved in police use of force affects everybody. The individual that the force is directed against, the officer, and force may be directed at the officer as well, the families and the communities. And if you want to talk finances, the top 10 cities in the United States lose $1.2 billion a year in civil suits, and about a third of that is connected to police practice. And so it is, if you start looking nationally, it is really a very expensive process for communities. And the irony is the pocket that pays that isn't connected to the pocket that pays for police training.
Yeah.
So there's almost, it's just an amazing chasm. And I don't know how to link those two. But if there's no question that if we could provide better training, we'd provide better service. Well, I would like to mention one study that's not published, but we with 8 universities, we tested 400 undergraduate students and asked them about the frequency of police use of deadly force. And I don't know where they got it from, but you just quoted how minute the statistic is. It's actually less than 1% of all arrest situations is any level of force used. Mm-hmm. And deadly force is like 1,000th of 1% of that. It is so remote, it's just amazing. But when we asked 400 university students, and it's an unfinished study, the average number of shootings is 1 out of every 5 citizen contacts. Now, I understand where there are riots, because if people believe that cops are using force at that level that frequently, it's amazing. And I don't know where they get it from. They may watch NCIS, they may watch LA SWAT, I don't know. But the perception is so different from the reality.
It's
shocking.
I want to talk about, I do want to bring that up in terms of the cases and things like that, and maybe some of the things you've worked on. But of course, there's, especially most recently, George Floyd, and in the past, like Walter Scott, and a lot of these things, they explode, right? And then they cause a lot of problems.
Right.
So maybe it appears that they're more frequent because we see them in the media a lot more and they make the news. But of course, you don't hear about the thousands and thousands and thousands of interactions on a daily basis where nothing happens, right? And everything works out. So, there's another paper in Applied Ergonomics, 2018, unintentional discharge of firearms in law enforcement. And that had to do with involuntary muscle contraction and contralateral irradiation and startle response. So different mechanisms that could potentially cause an officer to unintentionally discharge a firearm. And what was interesting there was that routine tasks accounted for a large percentage of the unintentional discharges. It was just something, typical stuff that they were doing.
Right. There's an error that is very common. It actually causes 1/3, and it's an error type. If you look at James Reason, who's done the most scholarly work, just retired, in research on errors. In fact, he's written the book Errors about 20 years ago. And if something falls out of a sequence, it's called a lapse error. And the first step in field stripping, a weapon that is striker trigger fired, meaning it's like a Glock. It's like a Glock trigger with the safety in the trigger, which actually releases, and with some of the mechanism. This is your expert area, not mine. But if they go to field strip that, the first step, and we will ask this of the class, what's the first step in field stripping that? And they'll say, pull the trigger. And that's not the first step. The first step is to drop the magazine and clear the chamber. But if you have not had enough practice at this, which is characteristic of the police profession, the first thing you do after a year of not attending to your gun, and now you're going to go qualify, and you're going to clean it before you qualify, you drop the magazine and pull the trigger.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and it's called a lapse error, and it's one of the more common types of human errors.
Interesting.
But that said, when Glock first started in the U.S., they would spend as much as 4 hours on field stripping over the course of a 3-day conversion program. And now departments are spending a half hour on field stripping and cleaning the weapon.
Really?
Uh-huh.
Interesting.
There's an interesting correlation between a limited amount of instruction and the amount of errors.
You have there's another paper. It's interesting because you focus on a lot of different areas. There's one in Law and Human Behavior, 2016, Memory and the Operational Witness. And this one is interesting to me because I remember when I was working on the Walter Scott case, this came up, and that was, it's almost you're damned both ways, right? So the officer, he's doing his best to recall this is what he remembers, but then it's like, well, you didn't remember it exactly. And then I remember one of the, I believe it was Dr. Charles Morgan saying something. Well, if everything was described exactly as it happened, I would be very suspicious, right? Because we don't expect people. In fact, people don't remember things exactly the same, nor do they perceive them exactly the same. And so there was a test that you ran where I believe there was like an encounter with an officer, and I think there's like a suspect pulls like a weapon or something like that. And you had 2 officers. One was an observer and one was doing the interaction. And one of them in particular, or I think 1/5 of them, or about 1/5 of them, actually thought they saw like the weapon being pointed at them or something like that. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, that was published in the journal Law and Human Behavior, the American Psychological Association journal Law and Human Behavior. And what we were looking at was cognitive load, and how much cognitive load we have, and how much would be tied up if an officer was actually trying to solve a problem versus observing. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but we have very little in the way of cognitive load or desktop space. We have a lot of memory and storage space, but we have almost no desktop space. And that accounts for why we have laws against cell phone use and texting and driving, is because we have such little desktop space, we can't manage multiple things at the same time very well. And so we thought that if an officer was tied up trying to solve a problem, might that part of their desktop space that's solving the problem interfere with some of the acquisition and retention of memory, not just from the point of view of what their attentional resources were directed to, but from the point of view of the available memory space for them. And what we observed in comparing officers who were active versus officers who were observers is the active officer. Their memory was similar to the observing officer right up until the last couple of seconds when they had to make a decision, they had to solve a problem. And once they got directed into that, their memory diminished significantly. And we think it's because of the attentional resources directed toward a task of solving a problem and then engaging a motor movement to address that. All of that ties up some of our cognitive space and diminishes the capacity to remember things, not just attentionally, but also from the point of view of what resources we have for consolidating that memory.
Yeah, it's interesting. And also, I mean, there was a paper sort of along those lines which had to do with performing under pressure. It was the one in Human Movement Science in 2012, gaze control, decision-making, and shooting performance. And there's a notable difference between elite or experienced people versus, a rookie that just comes out of an academy in terms of where they're looking, how they're looking, when and how they shoot. In fact, there's measurable time differences there as well.
Right. And we looked at this after we did a study on attention, because we were finding that there was a difference in the amount of attention that officers were able to give to something, and subsequently a significant difference in their memory, and that kind of connected to the level of experience. So we were looking at elite or expert performers versus regularly trained officers like those who were graduating from North American Police Academy. And we found an immense difference in skill, first of all, an immense difference in attention because the skill means that the officer has to direct their attention to the operation of their response, meaning the drawing, the presenting of the weapon, the decision to shoot. All of that pulls them away from the observation about what is happening there. So we put eye scan. We got Joan Vickers and got her the latest equipment. She's author of the book Perception, Cognition, Decision Training. Done a lot of work with Olympic athletes and teaching them how to look and see in the middle of an engagement. And she assessed the vision of these officers. We did find a significant difference, not only because of the skill level, the operational skill, but also because those officers who made great decisions and knew what, where, when, and how to look, they had a high level of clinical experience. And the person who has experience, who really understands the environment in which they will need to work, do much better at it. So whether it's a police officer or following that, Joan did a study with Canadian surgeons and found that the skilled surgeon looked at where they were cutting and the effect of it on 5 cuts ahead. And the novice surgeon looked at where they were cutting and the effect on 1 cut ahead. And so it really speaks about the need for expertise in decision-making, how to read, how to influence people. And that may be the most significant thing we are missing in police training, especially today, where people spend so much time on their cell phones and iPads and such little interaction with people, reading and understanding people and trying to evoke and convince and persuade is really a tremendous social skill. Yeah. And the expert officers were great at reading and seeing and understanding how situations could evolve. And the novice was scrambling from behind and then had to figure out how to use their tool. And by that time, they were seconds out of the time when the threat presented and when they responded. And the implications forensically for this is they could not tell us what happened for the last second or so of the incident, and their bullet strike could be at a very different place than when they made the decision on the evolving threat to act, to respond.
That's interesting. So you mentioned time, and I was just thinking in my head that a lot of the studies that you do also deal with, well, 2 things: time and distance. So how much time an officer may have to respond to an action, or whatever, and then also how much distance or how much space that they have to, perform a function or a duty. And I guess it all does come back down to time. But one of the studies you did, which had to do with the speed of a prone subject, you found somebody can, fractions of a second is really what we're talking about. And so they don't have a lot. So maybe you can talk about some of the timing issues, the distance issues. I mean, it seems like, are the officers always at a disadvantage?
If we nail it down to simply action-reaction, the officer's always at a disadvantage. But the key with the professional is the professional always ahead of time tries to understand so they can contain and control and diminish the threat. For instance, on our traffic stop study, we found that once the driver begins to assault the officer, and it doesn't matter which way the officer approaches the vehicle, once a driver begins to assault the officer is behind the curve. But the approach of an officer to a vehicle, how they approach the vehicle, and how they are able to establish psychological contact and influence and read what's happening in the vehicle are powerful controls in mitigating the possibility that the person they're addressing will assault them. If they can psychologically manage, influence, contain and control the person inside the vehicle, they are at a significantly less threat. And subsequently, it no longer becomes a case of your action will beat my reaction unless I do something first. It's a matter of how am I as a professional needing to address the concerns that I have with you so that I can effectively engage you and accomplish my professional mission. And that really is the key. And it connects directly to multiple studies done by the FBI Academy, particularly by their lead behavioral scientist, Dr. Pinizzato, who found that assailants on police officers are reading them all the time. And those that are professional in their practice and contact significantly diminish the threat potential, even by homicidal assailants, because of the influence they have on mitigating the circumstances and the potential for threat. And that's really where our work is designed to go. Mm-hmm. If you get to this point, it's a losing game. Therefore, you should never be there. What do you need to do to manage it before you get there?
Yeah. What would you say, this is the hard question now, what would you say to people who are critical of your work and saying, he's just a guy, he's there to, he's there for the cops, doesn't matter what happens, he's just going to say whatever. Do you have any sort of understanding of where maybe some of these people might be coming from, or how would you address some of their concerns?
Well, one of the things, and I hate to be cynical, but I used to think that there was justice, and that it was a fair fight in court, and that everybody got to be heard. And I really learned very differently that there are many people that have a vested interest. In fact, there's, as I mentioned, $1.2 billion a year in civil suits. That's a lot of money. And if our research impairs civil suits and some perceived unjust prosecution, there are going to be people who are really angry at us because we have bit them in places where they don't like to get bit. Mm-hmm. And they have reasons. In fact, the head of defense civil suit litigation for Los Angeles has phrased this, that if people can attack the messenger, they can block the message. And that's very true, because when I get on stand in court, I have to deflect statements made in the press versus the publication. We're looking at this point in time, we have 30 peer-reviewed publications, and we're on board for another 5 by Christmas time. Mm-hmm. Those are journal reviewers and editors that are saying, this is good work, and we're applying it in an appropriate way. And never in court has anyone ever said our conclusions are wrong.
Well, I mean, if it's
not scientific.
Yeah, and that's just the thing. So if you follow a scientific method and you're doing things and it's getting peer reviewed, I mean, if there's any concern, it's your peers that have to bring them up and say, hey, look, there's a problem here. Right. So, yeah, no, I can understand that.
Right. The allegations are made and they're made in the press. And the issue is, can I testify in court? And the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, no, for sure. Let me ask you about training. I want to ask you about the ForceScience Institute training. You seem to have a very successful training program, the certification class. What can you tell us about some of the offerings that you have in terms of training and how you prepare people that come through your course, your certification class?
Well, our really capstone sort of courses, our high-end courses, our certification course and our advanced specialist course. There's no question. We offer a number of other courses, and I'd be happy to speak about those. Our certification course, our teaching faculty are 5 MDs, all but 2 are trauma specialists, heading trauma teams in their hospitals and in their teaching units, and 2 are GPs. We have 4 PhD psychologists. Only 1 has no police experience. And then we have attorneys that work for Lexapol and some top-ranked international trainers. And that's our teaching staff for our 5-day cert course. Now, they'll only get 2 MDs and 4 PhDs in any 5-day course, and we change in and out. But we cover all of the aspects of human behavior connected to a force encounter. And we look at it from the point of view of an investigator, as well as an adjudicator of fact. Could be within a professional adjudicator, or it could be a legal. And what does that person need to know about the human performance elements so they can make an appropriate decision? And by the way, none of what we cover in those courses actually exceeds any of the human performance information that has gone into crash scene reconstruction for the last 70 years. Mm-hmm. because we cover perception, cognition, decision-making, memory issues.
Yeah.
And ironically, we draw on similar sources. Our advanced specialist course takes it to a much higher level. The students, it's a 300-hour course. It covers about 4.5 months. We meet every couple of weeks online. Students are working online that whole time, reading the literature, and then they get to have a group discussion. And then for an hour, every 2 weeks, they will meet the lead authors of that. For instance, I mentioned the type of decision-making that's most characteristic of officers in a time-compressed circumstance is recognition prime or naturalistic decision-making or fast and frugal. And the lead researcher on recognition prime and naturalistic is Gary Klein, who's co-authored articles with Kahneman, who's won a Nobel Prize on decision-making. And the students get to interview Gary Klein about recognition prime decision-making and how it relates to the type of decision process they're either training in the academy or they're investigating as investigators. We'll look at motor learning and performance. And Tim Lee out of McMaster's, 40 years experience at McMaster's, co-author motor learning and performance. They get to interview Tim Lee after they've read much of his work and how to train that and the implications of poor training or good training on motor performance and its effect on cognition, perception, and memory. And so they get to interview Tim Lee. So it's really a very advanced course. We do offer one-day acquaintance courses. For instance, I just did a one-day course for California Highway Patrol, and their officer involved shooting unit because they're doing much more now that they have to investigate a necessity standard as well as a reasonable standard. And it means they do a very different type of interviewing and they're looking for some different type of things. And so I spent a day-long program in San Diego recently with 120 California Highway Patrol homicide investigators. But I just finished a one-day with Miami-Dade homicide. Now, this week we've done a 2-day on de-escalation, and I think it's Nashville. So we do a variety of different courses, all connecting to human performance.
Right.
Within that.
Excellent.
And within our de-escalation program, we're also looking significantly at human performance and trying to read and understand dynamics and how it connects to officer safety, as well as the safety of the individual the officer's dealing with.
Well, it must be a popular course. You've got, I think you've posted something like more than 10,000 students. I don't know if that's on the certification course or just for all the courses combined, but
that's just on the certification course. We're somewhere in the realm of 12,000 students now. Wow,
that's pretty amazing. And so, do you normally recommend people will do the certification, and then obviously it would make sense, I guess, to do the advanced after that? That's a follow up to the certification course.
The certification course is the best way to go if you really want to understand human performance in high stress encounters. And we cover everything from the biomechanics to we do have one of our medical staff, actually a fair number of medical staff deal with sudden death in custody. So they have done the research on proning, positional asphyxiation, the blood flow issues with vascular neck restraint, and recording blood flow and oxygen saturation in the frontal lobes versus the lower brainstem. There's taser use, chemical issues with death in custody. You mentioned George Floyd,
right?
And the connection to the chemicals he had on board, how that might have influenced his response to what the officer was doing.
I mean, you're obviously taking a lot of this in your consulting as well. So about how often do you get out and testifying in a year?
Well, I don't testify very much anymore. What I do is I consult on cases, and we have quite an active consulting business. And I will analyze the case and detail out the types of factors that should be involved. For instance, we looked at an area that you're highly interested in and skillful in, which is ejected cartridge casing. And what do we know about that? And how does it relate to it? And if you need an expert, Eugene's the guy to go to.
Oh, well, thank you.
we'll make the recommendation for that.
Right.
So We'll look at the factors that need to be involved, but if it's ejected cartridge casings or if it's gunshot residue or if it's something else, but mainly our focus is on human performance and how these things connect to human performance and how that then connects to the forensic evidence.
Are there any cases that really stand out for you? Something you worked on or consulted on that was just like, man, like we're really making a difference here, or we're really helping here. Maybe things were not as they seemed when you walked in, and then it's just like, everything just starts to connect. Or is there any of those that you can talk about?
Well, I'll give you one from Ontario, Toronto Police Service. An officer was charged for shooting at a vehicle as was driving away. He said the vehicle attempted to run him down, and he fired 3 shots. He was in front of the vehicle as he accelerated toward him, just off the left front fender. He had his gun out. The first shot went slightly from side to front, just behind the B pillar. And then the second shot went in a little more direct into the rear, and the third shot went directly into the rear after that. The person who was driving that vehicle was convicted of assault against a police officer and went to prison. When they got out of prison, they went to get the car. The car happened not to be theirs, it was their uncle's, which they were not supposed to be driving because they were already under some sentence confinement that they could not be out alone at night, plus driving a vehicle. So they had borrowed their uncle's vehicle, and now their uncle's vehicle had bullet holes in it, which the uncle really got angry at, and they contacted the SIU. The SIU was unhappy for many reasons, including it was an officer involved shooting Toronto did not let them know about, finding it late, and they laid charges against the officer. We got a call, and we said, we cannot apply the human performance factors until we understand the forensic factors. And so they had a reconstruction firm out of California get a replica vehicle, give the acceleration rates and the turning that went with that. We matched it with the human performance dynamics from our research. We gave it to the attorney. The attorney used it to cross the forensic expert with SIU. They agreed. By the time I was going to get on the stand to testify, the prosecutor said, Your Honor, I've looked at Dr. Lewinski's report. I've consulted with 2 of the top police psychologists in North America. They said the report is good to go. I've got to live with it. We've got agreement that this report is accurate, and I request the jury convene and find the officer not guilty on all charges, and you validate that verdict, whatever the language is. So that was a
rare occurrence.
That's a rare occurrence in the court system. And by the way, one SIU investigator was really happy and very congratulatory to us after. And the other investigator scowled at me the rest of the trial. So it's a reflection of you can't win with everybody. No matter whether or not you prove something with science or not, somebody's going to always be unhappy because it contravenes what they thought about it.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's always 2 sides, right? So yeah, you're right. Yeah, it's one half is never going to be happy, that's for sure. Right. Well, we're getting on in time here, but I'd like to know what is next for you. What is next for Force Science? What are some of the areas that you really want to focus on? I mean, you mentioned some papers that are coming up, but where are things moving to, and what do you think are the sort of the future right now for you guys?
Well, the research that we're publishing now is using high-speed measurements on kinesthetics. We're looking at accelerometers and gyroscopes, repeating all of our original studies on assault time and turning time and movement time and that sort of thing. And it's 15 sort of devices downloading data every 7/1000th of a second. And we're using that and high-speed motion capture systems to repeat some of our earlier studies and get much more precise measurement of it. And we're discovering some really amazing things. On top of that, we're also using the same devices to look at attack postures. For instance, with edge weapon attacks, and I know the knife issue in the cable car, whatever it was, in Toronto, where the individual who was in the midst of mental health crisis had an edge weapon. The officer shot him. They made reference to the 21-foot rule. 21-foot rule has nothing to do with most officer edge weapon assaults. Most officers are stabbed within 6 to 9 feet. At least 13% of every officer in the U.S. that is injured in edge weapon attacks. It's very prevalent. In fact, 4 times more people are killed in the United States by edge weapons than by rifles. Mm-hmm. And so we're very interested in this close-in encounter.
Yeah, that was the that was the Sammy Ateem case. It was the young man that was on the thing. I happened to work on that case as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
we should hear a good Canadian beer over that sometime.
Yeah, for sure.
But we've got publications in the International Journal of Exercise Science and Applied Ergonomics dealing with movement and dynamic factors. And right now we've got accelerometers and gyroscopes measuring edge weapon attacks totally apart from time to close. And time to it's about stepping and stabbing, stepping and slashing, and all of that. And there's no question that edge weapon attacks all occur for the most part in under 1/5 of a second.
Amazing. That's great stuff. Excellent topics. I see we're getting on to almost an hour, so I think we're gonna call it a close. But listen, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. It's fascinating stuff. I could talk to you for much longer than this. You've got some really interesting projects going on, and I know some really good, just good topics of discussion and training and everything else. So thank you again. I wish you all the best of success with Force Science Institute, and hang back here. I'm just going to make a quick announcement, and then I'm going to come back in.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being on.
All right. Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, that does it for episode 11. As I mentioned at the beginning, just a couple of things, and that was the Cloud Compare course that's coming up on the 23rd of November. Next week, the IABPA conference, that's the Bloodstain Pattern Analysis Analyst Conference that's coming up the 16th through the 20th. 3 different regions. There's like 27 presentations, and all for $30. It's pretty cheap. Next week, I'm going to have Mr. Roland Angle, who's a professional engineer, on the September 11th, 2001. We know about the tragic story that happened where the World Trade Center towers fell and crashed. There was also a World Trade Center 7 building that crashed as well. And Mr. Angle has been studying that collapse, and he's going to talk to us about what may or may not have happened based on a study that was done at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So on that note, everybody, all the best, and we'll see you next week, Thursday at 2 p.m. Bye-bye.